according to your time zone. Very warm welcome to the DARE RC webinar on exploring the River of Life participatory approach. This is part of the DARE RC webinar series on building communities of practice and education. I'm Dr. Sahar Shah. I'm the Senior Research Manager at DARE RC, which stands for Data and Research in Education, the Research Consortium. I will be your moderator today. The FCTO-funded DARE RC program is an education research project implemented by Oxford Policy Management in partnership with the Aga Khan University Institute for Educational Development and Sightsavers, and it is dedicated to enhancing Pakistan's education system through high-quality research and evidence-based policymaking. So a bit of protocol for the webinar. We look forward to your queries and comments, and please feel free to share them with us via the chat box. We will address them towards the latter half of the webinar. Also, your feedback is vital to us, and we have displaying a QR code on every slide, which will take you to an online feedback form, which you can share with us later on. So today we are here to explore a very innovative and deeply human approach to research, the River of Life method. This method was used in the independent evaluation of the Girls' Education Challenge projects under the Leave No Girl Behind initiative. I'm thrilled to be joined today by two incredible speakers who bring deep expertise and field insights to this conversation. We have with us, first of all, Dr. Rabea Malik. Dr. Rabea Malik is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, IDEAS. She has served as assistant professor at the Lum School of Education with a PhD in education from Cambridge. Her research spans education sociology, political economy of reform, and early childhood in low-income contexts. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Rabea. We also have with us Dr. Asma Zubairi. Dr. Asma is an assistant professor at the Institute of Education, University College London. With over 20 years of experience, her work focuses on global education, policy, and equity in finance, especially in South Asia and East Africa. Dr. Asma, thank you for joining in. Over to you. Let's start with, I'll just stop sharing my screen. And so let's start with the why. Can you shed light on what are participatory approaches to research, and how does this method shift traditional power dynamics in research?
Thank you, Sahar, and thank you to all of you that are joining, and for that very important question as to what participatory research is and how it shifts the power dynamics between researchers and participants. So I'd like to begin, I guess, by talking about how more recently there's been a lot of interest in participatory methods, which are sort of apart from many of the traditional research methods that we're all familiar with, whether that be surveys, whether that be interviews, whether that be focus group discussions. Participatory research tends to be more visual in nature. So River of Life is one of these methods, but there are several of these methods which myself and Rabea have used in different contexts. Which are visual in nature, but importantly, they've been found to be very effective when working with marginalized groups or marginalized communities, and very effective when working with adolescent groups, which was the primary group that we were looking at for the Girls' Education Challenge. And I think what's really important to maybe reiterate about participatory methods is how central the participant themselves are in terms of feeding into actively being involved in the research methods, the research questions, the emerging issues coming out of the research, rather than being a passive recipient which is often the criticism of more traditional research methods. So that in some ways goes towards addressing some of the limitations relating to more traditional forms of research methods, which tend to be extractive, as opposed to participatory research, where the participant and the researchers are both actively involved in the research. It also gives marginalized groups more agency in being able to voice their realities. So if I go into this a little bit with respect to the Girls' Education Challenge, which we'll come on to in a moment, the River of Life was one method that we used alongside other more traditional forms of data collection, namely in-depth interviews. However, without the participatory methods, what we would have found was the more traditional methods around interviews would have not been context specific with relation to the girls. So if I go into that point a little bit deeper, it's to say that the River of Life itself gave us information that the girls themselves actually pulled out themes to then inform the more traditional methods. So it gives more agency with respect to marginalized groups or marginalized communities to voice what their actual realities are. One of the things that we may find a bit problematic also with respect to simply focusing on more traditional forms of data collection, which tend to be more numerical and written in nature in terms of generating data, is that, first of all, the quant surveys, for instance, don't really go beyond the numbers. So you could argue that, yes, you can mix that up with more qualitative data, but actually the visual forms of reflection which come from the participants themselves are also a really important contribution to the field of research methods, more specifically in the context of education. What's also really and I'll come on to this in a moment when we talk about the Girls' Education Challenge and beyond, but you can actually adapt these research methods to really reflect the environments or the groups of people or the country context that the research is taking place in. A very quick example is in terms of the materials that we use for the River of Life. That can really be adapted from community to community depending on what they are more comfortable with using. And I think one of the things with participatory research also is that if you think about it in the context of those of you that have done interviews, those of you that have done surveys, it doesn't really allow you time to get to know the participant. The participant, through the visual or participatory methods, are actually voicing their realities. They're actually the ones that allow, I guess, more sensitive themes to be addressed by themselves when they're going through this. And that can be a really effective scaffolding effect for researchers then to really draw into some of the themes that participants themselves have identified to then address in the more traditional data collection methods. And as I've said, participatory research is very easy to actually make more context specific based on the type of study that you're doing, the context that you're doing it in, and also the types of participants that you're engaging. And particularly with adolescents or young children, they're typically, I should say, more enjoyable to engage with compared to more traditional forms of data collection. So to give you an example, with the Girls' Education Challenge, we certainly did use IDIs, in-depth interviews. But what we found was using them in conjunction with the River of Life meant that a lot of the data was also a lot richer than would have been the case if we were just to have done the independent interviews by themselves. Sahar,
Thank you
is it
so much
okay
for
to?
that. Yeah, yes, thank you so much for that. Very informative. So, could you now take us into the heart of the method, particularly why was the River of Life used for the GEC study, and what did it allow you to hear from the girls that traditional methods might have missed?
Thank you, Sahar. So I just want to firstly go into the River of Life, and then I will go into that exact question, Sahar, as to why specifically this method for the Girls' Education Challenge, which I'll also give you a bit of background to. So what you see on your screen actually is one of the things I should also have pointed out is the beauty of participatory methods is they can use the same method, but you can have really, really, really different responses in terms of what you're getting back from different participants. So first of all, to begin with, the River of Life essentially is a method that allows participants to map out either visually through drawings or through writing, but it allows participants to provide very critical insights into their lives depending on what it exactly is that you're looking at in the study. So for the Girls' Education Challenge, we were more specifically interested in education and livelihood journeys of girls. But you can also use the River of Life to be a bit more generic, to ask them to reflect on a particular period of their lives. So essentially, in its simplest form, it uses the metaphor of a river. And some of the things that you can ask a participant to more particularly focus on is what their experience, for instance, has been of school or health services. It could also ask students or participants to reflect on what the influences have been from family, from community, from their peers in terms of their experience, for instance, in terms of schooling. Just thinking about the metaphor of a river, like I think the picture at the very bottom, where you sort of see the ups and downs of the river, thinking of that as a metaphor, I guess one of the things that we say is that when you're looking at a river going downwards, that may be a period of their lives where they experience more hardships. And if it's specific to, for instance, asking them to look at their education journeys, it could be where there was a particular hardship relating to a period in their schooling where things were a bit more challenging. So it allows you to look at both the barriers and the people associated to those barriers and what that meant in terms of education and livelihood journeys, for instance, or more generally their lives. But then when the river goes upwards, we're also looking at maybe that was an empowering period in the life of the participant and trying to unpack that further, either through the River of Life or in consequent methods such as an interview to unpack the shape of that river a little bit more. One thing that's also quite useful, you'll see at the bottom of the page, you also typically have some sort of a timeline relating to the River of Life. So you can also use it to think of what would the alternative life journeys for the participant have been had they not essentially gone on the life journey that they actually had done. And then you can also think about what they see as their future life journeys in 2 to 5 years from now, And this really is a good way of looking at what, for instance, their future aspirations would be, but what stands in the way and what actually supports them in reaching their aspirations. And there are a lot of like different visual things that you can do. So in a couple of these examples, you'll see great big rocks in the middle of the river. So that could be like a metaphor, for instance, of a challenge. So how you asked the question as to why we use the River of Life more specifically for the Girls' Education Challenge project. I would say that one thing we need to first of all introduce is the study that we were specifically looking at really related to the most marginalized girls within their given context. So we're looking at essentially the most marginalized of marginalized groups within 3-country contexts. And the study was really interested in understanding and looking at some of the barriers and enablers that girls experienced as a consequence of participating in the Girls' Education Challenge. It also really was interested in looking at some of the girls' aspirations, having participated in the Girls' Education Challenge project. One thing I should also mention is these are girls that had previously either been out of school or who had never attended school. So they'd either dropped out early or they'd never attended school. So I think one of the things that we needed to consider was both in terms of the themes that we were trying to identify, i.e. barriers, enablers, what their aspirations were, what they would have gone on to do had they not participated in the Girls' Education Challenge project. That lent itself very powerfully to the River of Life method. Another reason we used the River of Life method was because of the different timeframes that we were looking at. So we were basically looking at a time period which included before girls entered into the Girls' Education Challenge program, during the Girls' Education Challenge program, also after the Girls' Education Challenge program, where they would have either transitioned on to work, vocational or education related pathways, but also 1 year into the future to see what their aspirations were. So all those elements, together with the fact that these were some of the most marginalized adolescents, was a reason why we focused on the River of Life. And just to walk you through the elements, as you can see in front of you, we interviewed 98 girls in 3 contexts, Nepal, Ghana, and Kenya. And we asked them to reflect on the barriers that they faced in their education and livelihood journeys, what some of the enablers have been with respect to their education and livelihood journeys across all these timeframes. We also asked them to reflect on stakeholders who they specifically associated with either being a barrier to their education or livelihood journeys. And these were largely, if you look at the visual, these were reflected in the orange stickies. And then also stakeholders who they associated with supporting them. So those in the green stickies. We also wanted to understand that what did these barriers or what did these enablers mean in terms of their education and livelihood journeys? Did it, for instance, mean that they had to drop out of school? Did it, for instance, mean that their literacy and numeracy levels improved? But we also wanted to find out from girls what they envisaged for themselves had they not participated in the Girls' Education Challenge program. And also importantly, what they saw as their future aspirations in terms of what they wanted to do or be beyond the transition pathway that they would have followed. I'll pause there, Sahar,
Thank
in case.
you. Yeah. No. Thank you so much, Dr. Asma, for that very detailed explanation. So I would like to ask you, can you share a story that stayed with you? Anything that surprised you in the drawings or interviews? Any interesting, exciting piece would
Yeah.
be good. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the I haven't talked much about the figure in front of that you'll all see on the screen, but this particular story, I think what so this is just I should just note that this is an annotated River of Life, meaning that we basically, as the data collection team, would then translate text. For instance, this one was done in Swahili, but for the team back in Cambridge or the UK, we obviously had to interpret the data. So those great big pieces of paper that you see stuck on are actually annotations or adaptations to the girls' original River of Life. But regardless of that, what was very surprising for me personally was actually how much information actually girls were willing to share, even in the River of Life stage. We thought a lot of this information that you see in front of you, this was the sort of information that we would get in consequent interviews. But there were a great many girls, more specifically older adolescents. So one thing to also note is we interviewed adolescents which are termed as 10 to 19 years old. I personally found that the older adolescents, aged 15 to 19, there was a lot more written information, whereas for younger adolescents, it tended to be more drawing with less writing. But the thing that surprised me was actually how different in terms of the River of Lives that were coming back, but also how detailed the information was in terms of what girls were offering. So this specific story did stand out for me, I think, because this particular girl was a young mother, aged 20 at the time of the interview. But what you see here is actually her really addressing how her as an older adolescent mother, many of the communities around her were actually quite judgmental that she was going back into this education program, which was the Girls' Education Challenge program. So as a consequence, we actually found this was the case amongst many of the older adolescent girls, that the community members would really tease or look down on older adolescent girls more so than younger adolescent girls in terms of returning to school. There was also something very interesting which came out in the case of other girls' Rivers of Life as well. But to say that this particular girl, the Girls' Education Challenge project, helped her to open up her own business. So during the transition phase, some of the challenges that she identifies is that community members would essentially take things from her business, promise to pay later, and then not end up paying. And that there was this real challenge for her to say, obviously these community members owe me money, but she's not getting the money back, and that she actually identified where there was more training required by the project to the girls in terms of girls that had opened up their own business. So there was a lot of negativity around, one, her as an older adolescent going back to school or going back towards an education program, but secondly, community attitudes. But there was also something quite interesting in to say that whilst the communities were quite negative in some respects, there was also a great deal of respect for some of the skills that the girl had picked up, or the adolescent had picked up, namely financial and entrepreneurship skills, which were in great demand within the community. So on the one hand, there was negativity, but on the other hand, she did say that her standing within the community did improve because of the skills that the Girls' Education Challenge imparted, and which were valued and recognised by the community. So yeah, that's one story that stood out for me, Sahar.
Thank you so much, Asma. Sounds very fascinating. So, can you walk us through the process of implementing this method step by step?
Sure. I'm just going to go on to the next page for this. So just to maybe give a background, this workshop was a 3-hour workshop in most cases. One thing to note is that we were working in very remote contexts as well. So the girls were not necessarily always in the same vicinity, which was certainly a challenge, and I'll come on to that later. But essentially the workshop was held in the same space where girls would have participated for the Girls' Education Challenge education program that they would have attended for 6 to 9 months. The reason being is it's a space that they're familiar with. It's a space that their caregivers or parents are familiar with. So taking into account that there were some girls that had to travel quite far to get to this workshop. Now, within that workshop, we had, first of all, an icebreaker session. We had 2 facilitators, a note taker, and a psychosocial counsellor from the data collection team. And then we had about 6 to 8 girls per workshop. And the way that we divided the workshops was based on the type of transition pathway that the girls had gone on to once they had completed the Girls' Education Challenge. And so that often meant that you had younger adolescents all together in one workshop and then older adolescents in a separate workshop. We started off with an icebreaker of about 10 to 15 minutes, so that the girls could be familiar with one another and the data collection team. Then for about 20 to 30 minutes, the facilitator would, so I mentioned there was 2 facilitators. The main facilitator would essentially present what the river of life is and give an example of a river of life that they themselves had done. We tested this in the pilot to say it could either be that you come up with a pre-prepared one or one that the facilitator does in real time. So it really varied from context to context. But what we also found was it is really useful to bring a pre-prepared one so the participants can see what the river of life actually is. Then the majority of the workshop was actually spent going through these following steps, which I'm just going to go through. So the first one was getting girls to draw a timeline at the bottom of the page. So before, during, after the Girls' Education Challenge program and what their future aspirations are. The second is the shape of the river. And as I said, this reflects the ups and downs of a girl's education and livelihood journey. The third was what the reasons were for the shape of the river. So, for instance, if it was an upward shaped river, it was that the teacher was very kind. If it was a downward shape with relation to their education journeys, it could be something relating to the increase in household chores. And then what that actually meant in terms of the education or livelihood outcomes. So because the teacher at the Girls' Education Challenge program was very kind, some of the girls identified greater numeracy and literacy skills. But the increase in household chores meant that they had to miss school. And then we also wanted to see if there were specific stakeholders that girls identified with the reasons that they may have given for why the shape of the river was as it was. And then we looked at, I guess, asking girls the hypothetical question to say, what would you have envisaged doing if you had not gone on to join the Girls Education Challenge program? And many of the older adolescent girls talked about early marriage. The younger adolescent girls, it was often going to work on the family farm, for instance. And then finally, we had one period where we looked at what the girl sees themselves as doing 1 year into the future. Now, I mean, there is a question around this to say this can obviously expand to a greater period into the future, but we also wanted to kind of really keep it quite specific to 1 year, given that the transition period was coming to an end for many of the girls, and we wanted to see what they envisaged themselves going on to do beyond that. So those were the steps, and then following on those steps and the completion of the River of Life, there was a short break, and then girls all came back together, and there was a plenary discussion where they presented their own rivers of life if they were comfortable to do so. And I think that was about 20 to 30 minutes.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Asma. So obviously you mentioned there were some challenges. Of course, this method has a lot of strengths. What were some ethical or logistical challenges you faced particularly, and how did the team mitigate risks of re-traumatization during the workshop? Would you change or adapt anything if you repeated the study?
Yeah, those are two really, really good questions. So if I focus on the ethical and logistical challenges, I think there were two very quick ones that I want to focus on. The first is the logistical. I mentioned that many of these girls were coming from quite long distances from their homes. So in essence, they were there literally for the whole day. And what often happened was girls that had traveled the furthest distance. I mentioned that we also combined this method with interviews. So once the workshop was over, what would happen is there'd be a short break, and then we would then have interviews with them after the facilitators had tried to make the in-depth interviews a bit more context specific to the girl based on their river of life. So there was a couple of issues with that, and I think it leads to your second question in terms of what you would change. I think the reality was that it was quite a long day. So for those girls where we were able to do the interview on the same day, you could tell that they were quite tired. So I think if I was to change anything in the future, it would be to say, if you were to do this workshop, yes, there is a risk that this is the reason why we did try to do the interviews on the same day, that we might not be able to contact girls again to follow up with an interview. But I do think that if I was to do this again, it would be planning it so the interviews took place a day or two after the workshop. There was also the ethical considerations, both in terms of remuneration, but also the fact that these workshops were going to bring up issues that are quite traumatic to girls. I've done this workshop with my students here at UCL, but also students in a University of Malawi, and here with adolescent girls. In all cases, you're kind of reflecting back to think about quite sometimes upsetting, sometimes traumatic events. So there was the ethical consideration, which is why we brought in the psychosocial counsellor also, to say these things need to be treated very sensitively with respect to doing the river of life that can elicit quite upsetting memories. But on the other hand, what we also found was this was a really empowering exercise for girls who otherwise indicated that they wouldn't have been able to talk about their life journeys. The other ethical issue, as I mentioned, was the amount of time and remuneration. So we weren't allowed to, due to FCDO rules, allowed to financially remunerate them with money. So what we did with respect to that, some of these girls own their own businesses, they're losing money for the day. We actually, at the end of the workshop, gave each of the participants a pack, a beauty or hygiene pack, a learning kit pack, to the value of $15. But I do think that it's important to bear this in mind, that it is quite a time-intensive task, and you're asking people to kind of forego their businesses for the day sometimes to actually undertake this method.
This approach is, yeah, such an interesting one. Would you want to share something else on it, Dr. Asma? Should I turn to Dr. Rabea?
So yes, I don't like yeah, I mean, if we want to talk more about the Pakistan context and adapting this method, we didn't use this method for the Girls' Education Challenge for Pakistan, but yes, I think it would be great to hear from Rabia and it with respect to that.
Perfect. So, Dr. Rabia, turning to you, how do you see the relevance of this approach in the Pakistani context? And what potential does it have when working with adolescents here, particularly those who are impacted by climate emergencies or prolonged marginalization? So, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So as Asma explained, when this was introduced to us and when we were discussing and designing this project on climate change with adolescents, the reason this method spoke to us immediately and its potential for engaging with young people, first of all, is that often their voices are the least heard. So almost immediately, I think our primary concern was how do you get to document in a very systematic way the voices of these young people who are actually going to be living in this new altered world, the new altered climate, and to really understand their experiences of in general, the experiences of young people kind of get missed out. They kind of get talked at. They kind of get told what they're supposed to do, and we're not often listening to what they're experiencing, even without the presence of the new shocks that climate change brings. So our biggest sort of attraction to this method was the way in which it involves young people, not just as passive sort of reporters of sort of information, but in engaging in the exchange. So to make it participatory, to make the time that they spend with us, sort of as engaging as possible. But in addition to that, I think the aspects, the moving parts of this method specifically, and I'll talk a little bit about the potential of participatory methods in general after this, but for the River of Life, the parts that it has in terms of how it specifically allows the young person or the participant to let you know what their experience was and what their journey was, and then for you to draw questions based on what they've told you. So the ups and the downs, the nature of the shocks, the severity of the shocks. One is tailored to each individual, but then they get to decide what to reveal and how to talk about it. But the same kinds of factors in terms of challenges, barriers, but also people who may be champions for them, comes out of the same conversation. We found even in sort of from the GEC experience, I think engaging with Asma and the team and looking at the data that they collected, that you're able to get far thicker descriptions, far more nuanced stories than you would in a simple interview, which sometimes, if it goes on for longer than an hour, can become quite a tedious thing. People don't like to talk hypothetically. So the fact that this is an organized activity, the fact that it builds in really important aspects of what the shocks may have been, but also what the opportunities may have been. The fact that it allows the young people to very specifically give examples, to think about timelines, I think is the application, is the strength of this method that allows us to apply it to different things. So when we're thinking about it in the context of this study for climate change, it won't be a specific program that we're speaking to young people about, but the frequency and severity of extreme climate events in Pakistan has really gone up, particularly in certain geographical locations. And what we're hoping this method will allow us to do is get them to focus on timelines in the immediate past, where they've experienced either very high heat, flooding, pollution, etc., to talk about those aspects in relation to whether their schooling is disrupted, how their normal lives are disrupted, etc. But then also to get them in a very structured way to think about what does this mean for their lives, and how are they thinking about their own future. In the same geographies or maybe even in different geographies. I'll stop here for now before talking about broader participatory methods if you'd like me to.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Rabea. So please do continue. If you could just share one lesson that you would want practitioners or researchers to take away when using participatory methods like this. And is there any advice that you would give, you or Dr. Asma, you would give to someone who wants to start a River of Life workshop with the youth? That would be great.
Right. So in our research for sort of using and applying participatory methods in Pakistan, we've come across a couple of really fantastic examples that I wanted to bring. So the River of Life we're going to be doing the first time, and we'll be very happy to come back and share more once we've had these workshops and what our experience was. And hopefully we'll be doing this in Sindh, which is a relatively less explored area. So very, very excited about that. But in Sindh also, we came across in public health in particular, more so than in education, in public health, very large programs have been using participatory methods such as photo voice to understand the lived experiences of patients who experience or who go through or who suffer from TB. And then programs that are introduced to treat their tuberculosis and bring them out. But tuberculosis can be a very debilitating disease. It impacts your life and your family's life in many different ways. And there's lots of young mothers sometimes who fall victim to this. So we found some really powerful studies that used photo voice, working with young mothers to share what it meant for them to have received this shock, the ways in which it debilitated their lives and their capacities to live their own lives, but also to care for their families, and the ways in which being part of a program allowed them step by step to emerge from it. So diaries is one way of doing it, of course, but that can be very onerous also for the participants. But the photo voice method allowed them just very quickly to take pictures that meant something to them, to talk about it, and then not only share that with doctors who were part of this group, but also the broader public health community who was designing these programs, because it identified aspects of the program that were helpful for mothers that perhaps the team designing the program hadn't thought of, and other challenges that they had overlooked when designing the program. So that allowed a reiteration. So in many ways, sometimes you think that a lot of these qualitative methods may be purely academic, but they can be very powerful tools, not just for program redesign, but also for ways in which you can tweak then when going to scale programs, particularly for specific groups of people that otherwise sometimes you never hear from, that aren't even used to using, aren't even used to expressing their opinions about how they might be experiencing things. And so I'll stop there and hand over to Asma.
Thanks so much, Rabea. I just wanted to add maybe a couple of points, and I think, Rabea, you've summed it up really, really well. More practical points relating to the River of Life is what you all have noted I guess, from that slide where I was talking about the steps. I think it's really important to kind of think about, we were required, I guess, to in terms of how we had designed it, we were obviously designing it. We had a separate data collection team within each of the three countries that we were working in, but we had structured steps in terms of the river of life. So I think it's also really important to position that within, I guess, the objective of participatory methods, which is about giving more agency and voice to participants themselves. So one of the things could be, which we didn't do for this study, but it could be actually saying, if you want something that is more structured, where you're focusing on barriers, where you're focusing on enablers, where you're focusing on aspirations and stakeholders, one of the things could be actually to have a pre-workshop, as it were, to actually work with the participants themselves in terms of identifying the themes that you would want to cover in a river of life. So it's almost the co-design of a river of life method in terms of the instructions. It could also be that you don't really require it to be structured. So you may just ask, there's a few really fantastic videos on YouTube that you can find of this, done very, very powerfully with children who have been affected by conflict in northern Uganda, where the facilitator really does just say, I want to hear about your lives through the river of life method. So it was very, very free flowing. I think both methods, one of the things I would say is that this is quite a time intensive method, as participatory methods are. So the facilitators and the team that you have, there is a lot of training that is involved. And one of the things I would really urge people to do, I did the river of life, my own river of life, I think a month before we went to the field to actually get participants to reflect on their own education journeys. It's a hugely personal experience. And I think that was, doing it by myself, I think gave me an insight to say, this is a very personal exercise. Actually, how do we sort of manage that very personal journey that we're asking others to do? So yeah, two things, the design in terms of structure, which would also by extension look at the number of resources that you need, and also ensuring that you're practicing the river of life yourself as a method to really understand how it feels to do it as a participant. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Asma. That makes so much sense. I think all of us will be drawing our river of lives after this webinar. So we have a few questions in the chat box, and the audience, please feel free to share more. I'll just start with a question shared by Dr. Naima Qureshi, who is asking, do you think it has a similarity with phenomenology? So maybe you would want to take this question, Dr. Asma?
Thank you, Sahar, and thank you for that question. I think there are definitely, I think it definitely falls into this field of phenomenology because it is really about capturing life experiences. I guess the one difference we can say with the river of life is it's kind of really using the metaphor of a river to capture those life experiences, but it definitely falls under that philosophical sphere, as it were. But there are obviously a number of different methods to research that further. You could argue also the method that Rabea was talking about just now, relating to photo voice, that is also another method, which is also about capturing life experiences. So yes, I think a simple answer to that question is yes, it would fall within this remit.
Perfect. There's another interesting question. If we were to reverse the flow of the river of life, how might that reframe our understanding of agency, missed opportunities, or systemic barriers, especially in marginalized or underrepresented communities? You suppose you would want to respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's that's actually an extremely useful question. I think if, for instance, the purpose of your question is really linking or centering the aspirations to the River of Life method or to your study, working backwards is absolutely, I think, a wonderful idea. I have to be very honest. I've never used it in that way, but I think that does actually draw up a number of really interesting questions in terms of, first of all, the structure, but secondly, also, I guess, what the priority of the River of Life method is for it is for your study. So in this case, Ali, I think if we're really focusing on future aspirations, that would actually be a really wonderful way for the Girls Education Challenge project and the project that Rabea was talking about that we're doing for DARE. Aspirations is one part of it. So we did, I guess, use the more traditional timeline, looking into the future, going forward. But I do agree with you that I guess the prism or the reflection would differ somewhat. You can also, I mean, just to, I think this links a little bit to the question relating to linking it to other methods. I think what you can actually do is actually draw from this method what you then prioritize within the interviews going back. So I personally, I'll be quite honest with you, for one of the things that we found with the workshop, given that we were asking so much for girls to do, I think that last bit, the time frame relating to aspirations, girls certainly reflected on what their aspirations were for the future, but then really unpacking that in terms of what you're saying, Ali, working your way back, or some of the enablers and challenges. We simply did run out of time, but we were able to really focus a large segment of the interview on that future aspirations part. But yeah, I'll stop there to say I think, as it's a participatory method, I think you can this is the beauty of these types of methods, in that you can be a bit more flexible. Rabia, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
No, I agree. So I think there's flexibility, but the strength to me is the way in which it breaks down really big events or more invisible sort of aspects and structures it. So as long as that remains in place, I think, and then the complementarity with the interviews, I agree with what you said. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect. So another question coming from Sophia D'Angelo. Did you notice whether the method worked better or worse for certain students? For example, students with disabilities, but also certain personality types. Asma, this is for you.
Yeah. Hello, Sophia. Thanks for that really wonderful question. So yes, I think this is really important, because what we actually found was, in terms of the pacing, why the workshop did actually take so long is because certain students or participants did require a lot more support. So I think for the Girls Education Challenge, we had, I believe it was 3 or 4 students who had a hearing impairment and a physical impairment. So this is where the second facilitator becomes really important, because it wasn't just girls with disabilities, but also girls who had young toddlers. There were many girls that we had selected who were the most marginalized, who had young infants, who also attended the workshop. So this was really important in terms of having that second facilitator give more hands-on support, ensure that there were regular breaks as well. I mean, the reality was that the venues that these workshops took place in, they were carefully selected, but it's also quite a long session. So ensuring that more vulnerable students do have regular breaks, do have regular refreshments, but importantly, have that support by the second facilitator, who we found to be absolutely crucial, was important. But I don't think there was a restriction with respect to excluding certain participants from being able to do this method.
Right, perfect. So just a quick question before, just as a reminder, we have the feedback form link posted on the chat box. So please do share your feedback. And just a quick question, Asma, from Anam Fatima. Did any of the girls hesitate in revealing certain information, such as revealing the stakeholders related to the downs in their river? And how did you navigate that hesitation and fear?
Again, a really good question. And I think we were not, I would say we actually had the opposite problem, in that girls were oversharing. And why I say that's a problem is, remember, there is a plenary at the end, and that's a question that was quite, it invoked a lot of discussion to say, do we have a plenary, do we not? Because within that plenary, you will have girls from the same community. And in terms of the ethical procedure around confidentiality, we can't obviously impose that on other participants. So we had to kind of reiterate to say, obviously, share what you're comfortable with, and you're free to take part in the plenary if you want to. They were not obliged to do so. But I personally found that this was why the River of Life was so effective, because it's the sort of information that we probably wouldn't have been able to probe or really get at if this was just an interview alone. So yeah, I think our experience was the opposite, to say that they did actually share quite a lot.
That's amazing. Okay, so do we have another question? Just looking at the chat box. So far, none. So basically, thank you so much, Dr. Asma and Dr. Rabea, for sharing your insights, and particularly from the field. And so today we have learned that participatory research is not just about gathering data, it's about handing back the pen to the lives and dreams of young people who are too often silenced. A big thank you to both of you, to the DARE RC team, and to all of you who joined us. And do remember to share your feedback with us using the QR code and the link in the chat box. The session recording and additional resources will be shared with you shortly. Anything that you'd want to add on towards just while we are winding up, Dr. Asma and Dr. Rabea?
No, nothing from my side, Sahar. Just to say that I mean, there is a background paper actually to the use of the River of Life method in context of the Girls' Education Challenge. So some of the things that we've been discussing, I think that elaborates into a bit more detail with respect to the experience and the steps. So maybe that can also be shared.
Perfect. I think that would be really great. We're going to share that. Excellent. So, Doctor, we have information, we have comments coming in. The session went really well, very informative, and looking forward to the findings from Dr. Rabea, the DARE RC research project using this program. Thank you so much. We'll sign off now.
Thank you very much.
Most welcome.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.